questions. So this is going to be a remote talk. Hopefully we'll be able to pipe in Zoom here in a second, but I'll start introducing David Sussillo, who's an incredibly influential figure in computational neuroscience and now in the field of neuroscience and AI. So David Sussillo attended Carnegie Mellon University for his undergraduate degree. He then went on to Columbia University to do a PhD under the supervision of Larry Abbott. He then went on to do postdoctoral work at Stanford in the lab of Krishna Shenoy, and subsequently became a research scientist at Google Brain, and afterwards just briefly pivoted to a role at Meta Reality Labs, and he's also an adjunct professor at Stanford University. And I just want to mention how influential the work of David has been throughout the years. Personally, I think this is one of the most influential work in our decade. I'd love to welcome David to the scene here. Thanks, David.
Thank you. We did not run through a test, so I need some confirmation that you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, awesome. And so let me do, thank you very much for the thumbs up. And let me do, let's see, here's the share screen. And if I were to share this screen, I'm just talking out loud so y'all know what to. Now you should be seeing, if all has gone well, oopsie.
Can you hear us, David?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. All right, take it away.
Yeah, typically let me do present somehow the you'd think the first thing they would show you was how to present. Maybe that's it. Okay, think we're good, yeah?
Yep. All is good.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks for inviting me, and thank you for those extremely generous comments. Today, I'm going to be talking about how recurrent neural networks implement multitask, basically implement multiple tasks. And I first want to acknowledge the person who really did this work, which was Laura Driscoll. She's on the job market right now. It's really her work. This is also in collaboration with my longtime collaborator, Krishna Shenoy. So we want to know how does a network perform multiple tasks. So like sort of, by the way, there's no biological data in this talk, just so everybody knows. This is just pure modeling effort, but I hope that it's at least delineates some ideas that may be helpful going forward. Okay, so it's no secret that I've been a long time proponent of recurrent neural networks. Typically, you know, in 10 years ago, you'd have to describe what a recurrent neural network is. In this crowd, you have to remind them that not everything is a transformer. So anyways, recurrent, why do we care? Because obviously it's nonlinear. The computation is distributed. There's feedback, and you can, of course, train it. And by the feedback, you ping it with an input and it rings, right? And that's just fundamentally similar to how we believe brains are working. So that's the intro there. And there has been a lot of work using recurrent neural networks over the last decade, work on contextual decision-making. Parfetz was there with RNNs looking at motor control even in the early 90s, decision-making in the sensory motor cortex, grid cells and entorhinal cortex, songbird, memory representations, the work that we build on multitask representations, grasping. And then, of course, well, I don't need to belabor this, there's an entire subfield on feed-forward networks. And you know, really the first one was Zepser and Anderson in '88, where they showed that translating from retinotopic coordinates to head coordinates gave you gain fields. That's, by the way, not recurrent. But anyways, so some work I did with Mark Churchland and Matt Kaufman, I'm going to just dwell on for a very brief bit in the introduction because it'll help set up the rest of the talk. So we were interested in how monkeys made reaching gestures. So even though this is a maze task, the maze has nothing to do with it. It's not cognitive. Just think of it as a means to generate sophisticated arm reaches. And there was an ongoing debate about the representations in motor cortex, whether or not they represent the parameters of the movements, velocity, posture, acceleration, what have you, or if the firing rates of the network were really just a dynamical system to generate motion, right? EMGs, you just got to drive the muscles. So they had suggested that motor cortex was an engine of movement that uses lawful dynamics. How would you characterize that? How do you actually build that model? And that's sort of what I said too. And so what we did is, what Mark and Matt did is they recorded the motor cortex and they recorded the EMG, the muscle activations. And so here you could see a single neuron having different activations for different reaches, color-coded by different colors of the red to green. And then they recorded the deltoid, the pec, the biceps, the things that are typically used for moving one's arm. And so what we did is we built a recurrent neural network that just generated the EMG, right? And we gave it sensible reach conditions. And we just used kind of standard deep learning stuff for the time. And so now we have this system that generates EMG. And so one of the things that I've always tried to do in my research is to understand what's going on in these networks with slightly, like, not just descriptive language, right? So something mechanistic for me that's been state spaces and fixed point analyses. Although, one person's mechanism is another person's feature. So anyways, that's the level that I've been working on. And so we made sure that using representational similarity analyses like canonical correlations analysis, we made sure that the RNN looked similar to the brain. Indeed, it did. And then we went in and analyzed it, and we found a single fixed point, and we analyzed. I don't have the time to go through this because it's published research and it's old, but we did linearization analysis to understand that there were a set of frequencies. This is a complex plane used to understand linear systems. And we found that there was basically 3 oscillations that were primarily responsible for the variance in the network, and that was really close to the neural data, which was not used to train the model. And so, of course, we could provide a supporting argument, a sufficiency argument, that driving muscles produces activations that look like motor cortex, right? So that was the kind of thing that we were trying to do. So really, in summary here, RNN modeling is a concrete hypothesis generating mechanism if you can figure out what's going on in the network. And that's really the thing that's been on my mind for a very long time. How far can I push understanding the mechanisms of RNNs, which are just these huge, high-dimensional nonlinear systems? Okay, so that is a wake up that the actual talk is beginning now. And so I'm going to return to understanding how multiple tasks are done in a network. So almost all of the work that I showed you over the last decade, that's like very similar to neuroscience experiments. Do this tiny little task and then, get it tightly controlled and study the neural representations. But of course, the hallmark, especially these days with all of these AI engines coming out, the hallmark of human and really biological intelligence is flexibility. And so we sort of one extrapolation from flexibility, or one step away, would be a network that can do multiple things. And so that's really the motivation for understanding that. And it's really sort of open territory. There's not really been much done here. Okay, so let me just give you the core intellectual ideas up front. The actual techniques in this work can be a little complicated to understand in a short period of time. Again, as I said, most previous studies studied a single thing, a single network doing a single task. And what we found is that there's all these dynamical motifs, these fixed points, the skeletons, the dynamical landscape, and how the network set that up to explain how the task worked. That these dynamical motifs, in this talk, what I want to tell you is that these dynamical motifs in a multitask network are composed really to implement related tasks. And I'll tell you all about that. This is the core of the talk. And that really what I want to argue is that these dynamical landscapes are, in my opinion, a link between the single neuron, which can't really do very much. It's just a low-pass filter in these networks with a nonlinearity, and the network, which is magical, right? It's universal computation. So I'm looking for this structure in the middle. And well, I think I have a hypothesis for one anyways. So the idea is that you have these dynamical motifs like a line attractor or a decision boundary or rotations, great for memory or generating EMG, rotation, great for putting something into a from a null space to an output potent space. And that these are composed in different ways to solve different tasks, sort of based on what the task is. Some tasks have noisy stimulation, so you might need a line attractor for that. Other tasks have a memory component. You don't want it to read out until the end, so you need a rotation, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to start really simple. This is all on bioRxiv, by the way. So if you're curious about the deep details, at least we have a preprint right now. Okay, so let's start with the world's simplest brain, one-dimensional. Okay, and so if you study this, the dynamical variable is x. Just can I get a quick thumbs up on if you can see my arrow? Okay, I think that's a yes. Awesome, great, awesome. And by the way, this is done with a PhD student, this example with Sophie Lipkind at Stanford. Okay, great. And so we have an input U. It's just a parameter, right? But we think of it as an input in neuroscience. So because it's a one-dimensional system, you can draw a state space for this. But now, instead of just the 1D state space, which is what typically someone like me always looks at, you can plot the state space against the input variable. And what you see right away is that there's a lot of different dynamical systems here as a function of this variable U. So if U is 0, then this is the dynamical system you have, the one-dimensional system. When there's 2 fixed points, there's actually 3 fixed points, 2 stable fixed points. And if you set U to -1, then you jump all the way over here, and now you have a system with 1 single stable fixed point. And if you imagined that you had start the state X here, when U goes to -1, you'd hop over here, and it would just go to the fixed point. Now, if you set U to 0 again, you'd hop back over here. And the decay dynamics would just take you to this stable fixed point, and so on and so forth. So if U went to 1, you'd go all the way back over here. And then the dynamic, so basically you have a system that not only has memory, but it has the means to transition between those memories. That's what's so great about the nonlinear systems, that has all this stuff in it. And so what I want to understand is, how is this stuff organized? How are the fixed points organized? How do inputs change the dynamical landscapes in order to solve the different tasks that we're interested in? Okay, we call this kind of thing simple, follow the fixed point dynamic. You just change the input, there's a new fixed point, and you go to it, right? So as a function of U, you can see there are 3 qualitatively different pieces of this system. There's this 3 fixed point, 1 repeller, 2 fixed point systems. There's the 1 fixed point over here, and then the 1 fixed point over here. Okay, so now this is the 1D example. And so hold on to your hats, because we're going to try to do this thing for big networks. Okay. So we have a question: how do inputs reconfigure the dynamics of an RNN to perform multiple computations? And our hypothesis, of course, in hindsight, is that there's a modular dynamical motif organization. Okay. So this is all work that's built off of Robert Yang's, I think, highly influential work on multitask RNN. Okay, so this RNN has 15 tasks, kind of stuff you would expect in a neuroscience: delayed responses, reaction times, working memory, anti-responses, delayed match to sample, so forth. So there's a lot of meat in the task structure. Some tasks are shared, and some tasks are interfering. For example, pro-tasks versus anti-tasks. We have an RNN. And so the inputs, now I'm going to belabor the inputs here, because you saw how important that U variable was, right? So everything that goes into the network has noise on it, but we've just simplified with sort of very straight lines so you can see what's going on. There's a fixation period. Don't do anything until that turns off. There's a stimulus. It's a 2D stimulus encoded on a circle, and it's a 2D, it's a cosine, a sine theta of a circular variable. Then there's a task. This is now a 15-dimensional one-hot input, right? So that is, that's going to tell you what task to do. And now the outputs are just encoded in the same way. Depending on the task, there's going to be some combination of the stimuli that you do this or look that way, or I should say, regurgitate the input in a pro task or go the opposite direction. There's 15 tasks. There's a lot of different contingencies for this thing to output. Okay. Then there are some task periods. There's a fixation period where you just set the task. Then the stimulus comes on, and the system has to pay attention to that. And then there's a memory period. You may or may not have to have a memory of the stimulus that came in. And then you do the thing. Okay, great. So all standard deep learning stuff. We tested a lot of different hyperparameters, and the results that I'm telling you today, they hold across all the standard stuff you might try. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to train an RNN on one task, and then see what happens when you train it on another task, what changed. Okay, and then we'll eventually build out to 15 tasks. So train on one task, study the solution, train on 2 tasks, examine how the network solution changes. Okay, so we're going to start with the easiest task. It's just a pro task. It's just the fixation period. A stimulus comes on, again, it's a circular variable. And if the stimulus was look to the right, so to speak, you then, during the go period, look to the right. The network should look to the right. Okay. So let's just look at the fixation period. There's almost nothing happening here, right? But we're going to contrast it when things get more complicated. The fixation period is just do nothing, right? So if you look at a state space, by the way, there's a lot of state space representations in this talk, and I don't have the time to tell you what every single one of them is. You're just going to have to work with me that we chose good representations. And again, it's all on bioRxiv. Okay, so if you just plot the PCs during this time, you're going to see that the state is going to start from the X, and it's at the triangle as the current state. It just goes to a stable fixed point. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, right? The system is just preparing to do something. So I guess it's probably going into some like delay pro potent initial condition space. Who knows? All right. So we're just visualizing this again. Now you go to the stimulus period. And in the stimulus period, as a function of the circular input changing, you just have another fixed points. These are just fixed points that pop up, and the system goes to them as a function of the inputs, right? So this is, again, just another very simple follow the fixed point dynamics. And for the aficionados, they're all stable. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Here in black, I'm just showing the example we're working with, but as a function of the stimulus, you get a circular representation. And then during the go period, now you're supposed to do something. The system goes out of the output null space and sort of rotates in to the potent space. Okay, fine. As I said, these are pretty straightforward dynamics. But now let's see what happens when we add a delay anti-task. Now, that is to say, we train the network on 2 tasks now. Delay pro, which I just described to you, and delay anti. That is to say, when the same stimulus comes on as the delay pro task, you look in a 180-degree opposite direction. That's the task for the network. Okay, so keep in mind in the one task network, we had just a simple follow the fixed point dynamic, but now we go find these fixed points. There's this optimization we do. I'm not really going into the details to find the fixed points. And so we do that and get all that right. But what we see is that the system, there's actually now 2 fixed points, a stable fixed points and an unstable fixed point. Something changed, right? It added more structure. And that if you just run a whole bunch of initial conditions starting at the stable and unstable points, you can see that there's indeed what is effectively a decision boundary. And now if you go to delay ante, you change the task. That is, you flip the task to the one hot, right? And now you run the same thing and you see that the system goes to another place. And that there's also 2 stable fixed points and an unstable fixed point. And that the system has now oriented so that the state goes to some other part, right? You think, well, geez, okay, there's a delay anti-potent area, effective area, and a delay pro-effective area. Okay. So we got curious and we said, well, are these 3 sets of 3 fixed points related to each other, right? So it's like that U variable in the 1D. If you change it a little bit, do you just move things, or did a qualitative structure come out that wasn't there before? So what we did is we did what we call an input interpolation analysis, where you just vary the task input that tells you what the task is, delay pro versus delay ante, and you slowly vary it in a sort of convex combination from 1, 0 all the way to 0, 1. And we color code that. And what you see is that indeed, those fixed points are the same. They're the same according to this very mild transform the input and crazy things don't happen kind of sameness. So they're the same fixed points, just moving a little bit to control this decision boundary, right? For one, it's over here, and then for other, it's over here. Great. And I just want to point out that like it didn't have to be that organized. Crazy things can happen. Dragons exist in these networks. And yet it did this very simple structured thing in order to control the decision boundary and therefore control where the initial fixed point, initial state goes. Okay. So now we're going to look at the memory period of, excuse me, the stimulus period for a 2-task network, but I'm going to switch the tasks on you. I'm just going to pick something that has memory. So there's a memory pro task. And if you look at during the stimulus period, as a function of the stimulus, color-coded across the stimuli, it just goes to different places. Okay, that's very straightforward. It's follow the fixed point. And indeed, in circles, those are the fixed points that it goes to. Now you go to the memory period, because this is a memory task, the stimulus disappears. Of course, it has to remember it. And what you see is when you run the system, that it just hangs around where it was. It remembers the stimulus. Right. And when you do the fixed point finding routine to find the fixed point organization, indeed, you find a ring attractor, which is exactly the right memory structure if you wanted to remember a circular variable. So now we're going to change. This is the 2-task network. We're going to change the task on you from the memory pro to delay match to sample. Anyways, this is also a memory task. It doesn't matter the details of what the task is. So we change that task variable. And what we see now, I'm just running both states for the memory pro and the delay match sample together. You see that they just kind of do the same thing in the same visualization of the state space, right? So, well, what's going on? We do this input interpolation analysis, interpolating between the delay match to sample and the memory pro task input. And what we see is that there's a highly approximate, but nonetheless a ring attractor. And that ring attractor is shared between tasks, right? So this system basically, it's probably pretty hard to build a ring attractor. That's a guess on my part. And then it just repurposing this structure, making sure that the translation as inputs change, it doesn't screw anything up so that the same dynamical structure can be used across tasks, right? Okay, so I've showed you some examples in a 2-task network, but now how do we get out to 15 tasks? If I did plotted fixed point structures, they get completely insane. We'll try a couple of them anyways. So what we want to do is come up with an analysis to understand what might be happening in a network that actually has 15 tasks trained in it. And here we build again heavily on Robert Yang's work, where he discovered that there are actually clusters of units that involve similar computations. There's a sort of modularity in the neural network that comes out of the tasks. And what he did is he said, well, I'm going to look at the variance of a unit. Pick a unit in the network, call it unit 2, and just ask, as a function of all the different tasks, what is the variance of the unit, right? So, because for example, unit 2 and task 10, it has a lot of variation, but in task 11, it's not doing very much. So you can sort of surmise that during task 10, this unit is more active. It's probably more part of the computation. And Robert did this for the stimulus period and to do this variance computation. And what you get is that as a function of all the different tasks, you get a normalized variance. How active was the unit? So for task 10, not very active. For task 11, not very active. Okay, so you can get this barcode for the units. But what I just showed you is that a central aspect of reconfiguring these dynamical systems is the inputs they receive. And how do you change the inputs in these networks we set up? You change them as a function of the task period, right? The fixation comes on, the stimulus comes on, this thing goes off. So, right, so we have different dynamics as during the different task periods. And so what we did is just do the same analysis, but instead of on the task, do it on the task period. And so this analysis identifies that units contribute to different parts of the computation in the task period. And so we get a much larger, we chop this up and do the analysis, and we get a much larger sort of barcode for each unit. And if you just colorize this barcode, right, task period, memory probe, fixation, stimulus 1 for delay ante, so forth. If you just color code this for all units, all of a sudden you get what we call the atlas. And this is, once you sensibly organize both the tasks and the units, just doing some very basic clustering that doesn't change the information in the matrix, What you see is, I mean, the tasks have labels, right? So you can just look, you can intuit about them. Well, there's anti-tasks, there's early memory tasks, there's response tasks, there's reaction time tasks. And then the units are just clustered in terms of their organization, in terms of their activities. All of a sudden, these structures pop out. There's an anti-motif, there's a response motif, and we're labeling these just based on what the tasks do. There's a stimulus motif. And there's even some motifs, some units that don't appear to be shared at all. That something about reaction time is just so different than everything else that the network just had to go build its own little subnetwork to do it. And this is all, if I can use the word, emergent, because the GRU in this case was just randomly initialized. Okay. We did our homework across many different hyperparameters. We found the same stuff. In the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor that, but it's in the paper. So if you had a, if you really believed there was a modular structure in your network, then there's some implications to that. Number one would be lesioning, right? So if you could identify this response group of units that were responsible for the response period across different tasks, then if you lesion that thing, you're going to break the response, right? So you can do the experiment. So when we did it, we came up with a metric for performance. Doesn't matter what it is. It's public. It's not published. It's in the manuscript. What we found is that if you're not a delay task, then you're really not affected by lesioning this group of units. But if you are a delay task, you're profoundly affected. It just destroys things. And here I just have two examples. A reaction pro task does not have a delay, and therefore there's the lesion versus no lesion. Just shows that state space, so the things aren't screwed up, but they are screwed up in the memory because it needs to have the line attractor that this subgroup of units builds. Likewise with anti. If you look at if you just lesion these 4 units, your anti behavior just goes to the floor. It's awful. And again, you can visualize that, but the quantitative result is there. So, Robert actually published this. Well, he published that you can lesion these modules and that they affect the tasks. See that related tasks are impacted. But what we want to say is that only task periods with relevant motifs are impacted. We want to go deeper and explain this result in the context of the dynamical skeletons, the fixed point structures, and the dynamical landscapes. So let's delve deeper into the response. If we look at the memory period, we're going to look at a memory pro task. This is all about memory. So when the stimulus comes on, that should be pretty straightforward. Nothing goes wrong. And the fixed points do get complicated here, but I want to focus on these 2 black lines, that they start in the same place in the non-lesion in orange and the lesion in blue, and their fixed points that they go to remain intact across the stimuli. There's some other stuff here because, well, these systems have 15 tasks in them, they're complicated, but stimulus is not affected. However, now you go to the memory period. Remember, we've lesioned the thing that we think is the line of is the ring attractor. We've lesioned this group of units, and so now you can see that the full network still has this beautiful ring, but the ring structure has just been destroyed by lesioning these units. So it should be no surprise it can't remember anything. Now let's go to the response period. Well, it turns out, how did the network implement the response period? It repurposed the ring attractor, and it just rotated the entire ring attractor. So when in the lesion, I mean, not only did it not have a memory of anything, but it couldn't do the rotation anymore. And you can see 2 examples here, the working correctly and not working correctly. So you can see that there's just a profound reuse of dynamical structure in the network going on here. Okay. So to show you that, we did a task interpolation between when the fixation is on and versus off in the memory pro task to say, well, what's going on with the ring attractor going to the go period. That is to say, it's time to do something. Don't just hold the memory, show it. And what we found, I don't know how this shows up across the network, but you can see that the ring attractor just rotates, right? And so the implementation is this ring attractor just getting reused in 1,000 different ways. And here's the picture of it in case that animation is poor. Okay. So I'm going to finish because I know we're running behind. We have another section. I'll speak on it for 30 seconds. We have another section. If you believe that there are motifs in your network, then you should believe that there's some reuse. If you train with some of the tasks in, and then you train on a task that reuses some of that implementation, it should train faster, right? It should do better. And we ran those experiments. I'm not going to go into it because we're running out of time here. But the long story short is this also bears out. It's another piece of evidence supporting the idea that there are motifs, modular motifs in the network. Okay. Great, just wanted to make sure. Great, so I'm summarizing here. Great. So the main findings in this study of recurrent networks is that there are modular fixed point structures that are reused across task periods, right? So the generalization of Robert's work is that we've identified the substructure that's being repurposed here, right? And that networks that are trained to perform multiple tasks, they implement shared motifs. This ring attractor is used across all the different all the different tasks that have a circular variable to remember, and it even uses it to rotate it into the output put-in space. And that the previously identified clusters are a result of these modular dynamical motifs. And that if you lesion things, it's modular because of this. And that there's fast learning. Again, I didn't have time to go into that. So again, this was all work really spearheaded by Laura. Thanks some of our collaborators and our funding sources. And I'll just leave this up here as a talking point, or if there's any questions, or if we have any time for any questions. I'm not sure we do. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, David, for this amazing talk, and thank you for indulging in our delayed schedule. So we have time for maybe one or two quick questions if people are interested. So I think there's one question here on the floor.
Can you hear me? Thanks for the talk, David. When you train in RNN, you have to make decisions about how to implement the tasks that you're interested in studying, but also how you encode things like stimulus. I was wondering, you went with circular stimulus. Why did you choose like this sine cos component encoding? How would things have changed if you were to use, you could have done like Cartesian X, Y, or just radius, radians. And do you think that the universal dynamics you find are only hold within one set of encodings?
Oh, I doubt that very much. You see the same thing in line attractors as you do in ring attractors. So we made a simplification from Robert's work. Robert encoded his rings in a high dimensional way. So it's basically, like radial basis functions across the ring. And it was just too much to explain. So we actually simplified things here. But I think it's I don't, unless you came up with like some crazy encoding that just didn't make any sense, I'm not too worried about that in particular, the encoding question.
One more question from Shahab.
Oh, thank you very much, David. Great talk, beautiful work. I have a very general question. So the tasks that you're training the network on, they have a very long history in psychology and cognitive science, and they have been designed with the modularity mindset. So the tasks are designed in a way that they're basically defined in a compositional way. Different cognitive, perceptual, executive, motor components are separate in these tasks. What would happen? Do you think, would it be different if the networks were trained on more naturalistic tasks?
Yeah, I love this question. I think I couldn't show you. It's a guess. I think the techniques and even the results of this talk would hold to a large degree. But we'd have to try it. And so in all of this work, I mean, I didn't state it, but like managing complexity is the #1 issue, right? If you try to do this on something hard, you have no idea what's going on. So there's been this very sort of intentionally incremental approach to some of the work I've done, because otherwise you have no idea what's happening. And but I think it's a great research direction to follow up.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have one last question from Zoom. So Mata is going to read it.
Yes, this is a question from Aida. She says, absolutely love this talk. Many questions. To start, just a few. Are the modules you're finding in any way similar to brain regions or cognitive capacities human studies confirm? The second one is, have you compared performance on human task set experiments that reveal human brains errors and asymmetries in response to different conditions, task switching, task shielding, costs, etc.? I'll have more, but I'll stick to this.
Okay, great. So the first question, I forgot the first question. I was ready to answer it.
So, anatomical correspondence.
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
so it's not lost on us that there could be some correspondence there, but it'd be real work to get at that. It's not crazy if you know that you need to remember circles. Then build a circle rememberer, right? I mean, that's in the fly, they've got that navigation ring, right? So, but this would be, the way that I would answer that question is, this is all just like, first salvo into the dark, and that a huge amount of work would have to go into bridging this to something like brain regions. And for the final question, in terms of comparing to human behavior, I think that's really interesting. I think, in fact, that's one of Laura's research aims. You would have to get some things correct in the network. So, for example, reaction times, right? Like animals have reason they react quickly. There, and that's not in this network. So to the degree that you wanted to get in that direction, you would have to really be careful and thoughtful about some design decisions. Thank you.
All right. Please join me in thanking David once more.